Well, let's take our Bibles, please, at this time and turn back to the Old Testament book of Exodus in the second chapter, Exodus chapter 2. I think we're all familiar with the man Moses, and we give a lot of kudos to Moses. Even the Jews in the New Testament, we're still talking about Moses. He was a huge hero of theirs, and of course, we think of him giving us the Ten Commandments. We think of him being the deliverer of the Jewish slaves there in Egyptian bondage, and that's all true. But what about the mom and dad of Moses, the parents of Moses? Of course, on a day like this, we want to talk about the family. We want to talk about the home. And so let's take a look at this man, Moses, but more so the parents of Moses, and let's learn some things from them. In Exodus chapter 2, beginning in verse number 1, it says, "And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi, and the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maids to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw a child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, 'Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages.' And the woman took the child and nursed it, and the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, 'Because I drew him out of the water.'" Now we find something very interesting in the childhood story of Moses that I think will help us 21st century parents and grandparents in what I call giving God to the next generation. Giving God to that next generation. Let's pray before we begin. Father, we thank you now, Lord, for the opportunity on this very special day to be in this special place with special people and a special book and thy Spirit to guide us in it. Help us now as we look within the Bible to learn some things that would help us to give God to the next generation and to make a great difference. And we'll thank you for it. We pray now and ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Folks, as I look at our society and I look at our culture and I look at our world today and I look at some of the things taking place around us, I would have to say that perhaps our culture is as black and ungodly as it has ever been since the time of the flood. Now, there have been more regional times where there was a Sodom and Gomorrah and things along those lines, but I don't know if worldwide there's ever been a more ungodly environment as we have in the world today, and it's just getting worse, and it's predicted to get worse according to the Bible. However, that's not totally bad for God's people, because the darker the night, the brighter the light. So you and I have a real opportunity to bring God to this world right now. Somebody says, well, I don't have very high hopes for the coming generations, and I see what's coming up the ranks here. It looks pretty bleak. We have a young generation today that are really turned off. I mean, they're just into their gadgets, they're checked out, and they're not really interested in the Bible. They're not really interested in God, and yes, there is some of that. However, we just had a VBS around here a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was better than ever. I think the children were more interested than ever. From what I hear, they were more engaged than ever. They had good questions, and maybe we have a younger generation that is starting to see the shallowness of all that glitz and all that glimmer and all that gadgets and glitter out there, all the electronics. It's like, what can they do next? What can wow them next? And so I think they're looking at a lot of that and starting to yawn. And I think that even Gen Z is getting kind of bored with all this whiz-bang church that's going on, that's entertaining, and it's production, it's a big show. You know, I think there are some young people out there today that want truth, don't you? I think they want truth, straight, solid Bible truth. So how can we get God to them? How can we give God to the next generation? There's a man that's mentioned in the Bible 13 times, as far as I can count, 13 times. He gets no glory. He gets no credit. You probably don't even know who I'm talking about. His wife, Jochebed, gets more kudos than he does. And she's the one that we know who is the mother of Moses and did all this stuff to preserve Moses and so on. Even the sister of Moses, Miriam, gets more ink in the Bible and credit, more attention than the dad does. And of course, there's the famous son, Moses. He's a hero of the Jews, and there's movies made about him. His name is mentioned 784 times in the Bible. Imagine that. And yet, you see very little on the dad of Moses, the dad of Moses. You say, who is he? What's his name? His name is Amram. Kind of sounds like a tough truck, doesn't it? An Amram. But his name is Amram. And when have you ever heard a sermon on Amram? And to my shame, I've been preaching for decades, 40 years, however, and I don't know if I've ever preached on the man Amram. But he is mentioned 13 times in the Bible. Now, that's way more than even guys like Jabez. You know, I preached on Jabez, the prayer of Jabez, and he gets this little teeny blip in Chronicles and all this fanfare. But here's Amram, the father of Moses, and we know little about him. Now, hold your place here if you would, but look in Exodus chapter 6. Just go forward a few pages and let me introduce you, first of all, to the man Amram, and then we'll talk a little bit about him. In Exodus chapter 6, and in verse number 16, it mentions the sons of Levi. Now, who was Levi? Well, Levi is the guy who's credited with starting the Levitical priesthood. So we're kind of counting down from Levi. We're looking at his boys. And in verse 16, you notice this guy named Kohath. Kohath, one of the sons of Levi. Now, what came out of him? Well, look at verse 18. And the sons of Kohath, Amram. So there's that guy, Amram, who gets mentioned there. And then you get to verse 20. It says, and Amram took him Jochebed, his father's sister, to wife, and she bare him Aaron and Moses. So we're introduced here to Amram. But it's Jochebed, his wife, who gets all the credit, who supposedly had all the faith, who hid Moses for 3 months and put him out there on the Nile. And as a result, we kind of just brush off and blow off Amram like he was void of all of this, had nothing to do with it, when that is not true. Because we turn over to the New Testament, we won't now, but we find a chapter in the Bible, Hebrews 11, known as Hebrews Hall of what? Faith. Hebrews Hall of Faith. It's mentioning these giants, these who's who of the faith, and we find this in verse number 23. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his mother, because she saw he was a proper child and she wasn't afraid of the king's command. Am I reading that right? No. If you're paying attention, I read it wrong on purpose. Look at it. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his who? Parents. Parents. That would mean Amram as well, because they, plural, saw he was a proper child, and they, plural, were not afraid of the king's commandment. So Amram was in on this. It was a mom and dad thing. It was teamwork. It was a partnership. And together, they exercised faith. I'm talking about some great faith here. Because if they had been caught, it wouldn't have been Jochebed who would have been put to death. It would have been Amram who was responsible and put to death. It's time we realize, it's time we recognize, and time we give some credit to Amram. I think he's sitting high in heaven, even as I speak right now. He was a man of faith, and the verse above says so. It was not the faith of Moses. It says by faith Moses, and you say, well, he had great faith. No, he didn't. He was a baby. He had no faith. It was the faith of his mom and dad. They decided together, we need to do this. And as a result, they handed on God to the next generation, and they made it into Hebrews Hall of Faith. So what did they do? Well, they hid him 3 months. 3 months. That's a long time to try and hide a baby. Can you imagine the fear during those 3 months? Can you imagine the tension? I mean, for 3 months, they're trying to keep him quiet. If this baby squawks as an Egyptian soldier is walking by, they would be caught. Or if there was a Jewish double spy who narcs on them, they would be caught. And so they hid him for 3 months. Why? It tells us here he was a proper child. What's that word proper mean? It means fair. He was beautiful. He was a handsome, cute little baby. And by the way, that's the norm with babies. Real men love babies. There's nothing wrong with loving babies, all right? But there's something not recorded here, and we have to almost assume it. As we move on to verse 24, we find this in Hebrews 11:24. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, why would that be? Why would he say, no, thanks, but no thanks? That doesn't just happen. Well, you know the story. We just read it here a moment ago back in Exodus chapter 2. Pharaoh's daughter goes down the riverside to take a bath. She sees this little ark and the bulrushes there. She asks the maidens to go pick it up. She brings it over. There's a baby inside. And she goes, what am I going to do with this baby? I can't nurse this baby. Well, Miriam, the sister of Moses, has been following along, and she goes, I could find a Jewish mother for you that would nurse that baby. There's plenty of them right now. Their babies have been taken away and thrown in the Nile and put to death, and they could nurse. And in God's providence, Moses ended up right back in his own home, the home of Amram and Jochebed, and those two parents didn't have a lot of time to raise him. They only had so much time to instill in him some godliness here. So back here in Exodus chapter 2, we find this in verse number 10. It says, and the child grew, and she, that is Jochebed, brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she, Pharaoh's daughter, called his name Moses, which means plucked up out of the Nile. Now, how old was Moses at this point? Because how much time did the parents of Moses have to train him? Well, I don't think he was still a baby. She was nursing him, and obviously Pharaoh's daughter couldn't handle a baby. I don't think Moses was even a toddler at this point. I mean, you got a diva princess here in Egypt, and it's like, what do I want with a dumb little toddler? Get him out of here. I don't know if he was 3. I don't know if he was 5. I don't know if he was 10. I just know that word grew. Notice that word grew. The child grew in verse 10 is the Hebrew word gadol. And that word implies that Moses advanced. So he knows some human skills at this point. He is sharper, and it's a result of mom and dad being proactive in training him because they only had so much time to do it. And they knew their time was limited. So if Moses was trained, if Moses was sharp, if Moses was godly, it wasn't because of Pharaoh's daughter. I'll guarantee you that. She was a total heathen. It was mom and dad. So would Moses turn out right? Because he's about to face the trials of his life. Egypt was an ungodly place. It was an evil, wicked place. It was heathen, it was pagan, it was ungodly. How would he fare in the midst of that culture? Well, we read this again in Hebrews 11. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, I don't know if he did this publicly. Oh, no, don't call me Pharaoh's daughter. I don't know if it was a defiance there. I don't think so. I think it was more in his heart. Like, I'm not Pharaoh's daughter. I'm a Jewish boy. I belong to Jehovah. I'm a part of Jehovah's chosen here. And something had galvanized him from within. He had some solid rock-ribbed convictions. And who put him there? Mom and dad. Mom and dad put him there, his parents. Notice in the next verse, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. I wonder how many young people in this town would turn down the pleasures of Egypt for God. I wonder if there's not some young people in this church who would say, you know what, I don't think I could do that. But Moses chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. We read on, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. So he esteemed the reproach of Christ better than the treasures of Egypt. How in the world did he have that kind of backbone? The Bible tells us in verse 27, by faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Meaning, mom and dad had taught him some things about Jehovah God, though he couldn't see him. He endured, he kept going as seeing him who is invisible. Amram and Jochebed raised the deliverer of Israel. You know why? Because mom and dad believed. They believed. How did that happen? How did they give God to the next generation, to Moses? Well, I think it involved three things. Three things that work for them. I think three things that'll work for you if you're a mom or a dad or a grandpa or grandma sitting here today. And the first one is what I call to resist pop culture. Pop is short for popular. And we find here there needs to be a resisting of the society, the pop culture. If we're ever going to mold a godly kid, they are going to have to resist the ungodly pressure of this world. And folks, I'm telling you, that pressure is intense. This world is ungodly. And kids, honestly, they lack the sense to see through it. They need some help at that stage in life. You know, a young person can grow from a toddler to elementary school to high school, and they can develop and they can turn into a man or a woman, and they can have a deeper voice for a young man, and they can grow a little fuzz on their face, and you can say, boy, they're growing up in every way. They're an adult. But let me tell you something. There's something that still hasn't caught up, and it's their ability to reason. So they might be responsible. They might have a cell phone. They might have credit cards, and they might, well, they look like an adult, and they might. But the ability to reason, honestly, I think it goes into the early 20s even. It's slow to catch up. And that ability to reason is something that is hamstringing a lot of young people as they get into what I call the mistake zone. From about 15 to 25, a lot of young people make huge mistakes because their ability to reason has not caught up with them. And as a result, they need some parental guidance at that point. Because the last thing to develop is that ability to reason for their own good. Mom and dad, you got to keep working with them. And young person, keep listening to your parents, all right? You know, young people can fail to see the wisdom in mom and dad at that stage of life. And so they want to cut corners, and they want to capitulate, and they want to compromise. And you know what'll happen? Mom and dad, if you're not careful, it'll wear you down. Because kids will be relentless, and they'll keep trying to get you to compromise. And I've seen a lot of parents that when the kids hit the teen years, the parents start compromising. And instead of those parents molding that kid into the image of Christ, the kids, the teenagers, get the parents to abandon the right standards and compromise and get on their level. And many times I've seen teenagers turn the whole family around. And get the whole standards dropped to mom and dad. They go down because of those rules that just blow away because the kids just won't let up. Oh, we don't want to do this. We don't want to do that. We don't do that. And let me just say this. Our kids didn't always like our rules. I'll guarantee you. And they're sitting up in the balcony around this place right now. They didn't like our rules all the time. But I do think they appreciated the fact that in our home there was consistency and those rules weren't going to blow away. We're going to live by this book, and we're going to love God and serve Him and so on. And they didn't break mom and dad. Mom and dad don't let them break you. Now, apparently, Amram and Jochebed had installed some godliness in Moses because Egypt couldn't break it. I mean, all that temptation in Egypt, it just couldn't break it. And that faith was handed on to the next generation. Now, let me just say this generation we're living in today, this society, this culture, I said a moment ago, it's ungodly. And it's as ungodly as I've ever seen. There are things taking place and have been taking place in just the last 25, 30 years that I would have thought were unthinkable at one point, honestly. I was born in 1960. I am seeing things today that I would have never imagined would take place. You know, up and down in our neighborhood growing up, every home had a mom and a dad. Every home had brothers and sisters, and they all came from the same mom and dad. That was just the norm back in that time. And when I was growing up, guys liked girls, and girls liked guys. And guys married girls, and then they went to work supporting their gal, and then they had children. And those children grew up in sandlots and playing and having fun and things along that time. And it was a time when boys knew they were boys. And girls knew that they were girls. There was never any question about any of this. It's a different world today. It's a totally different world today. It's a different culture. And it is going to take courage on the part of mom and dad to resist that culture. You have to resist that pop culture. And by the way, I don't envy you. It was tough raising kids at the time I was raising kids. It is even tougher now. The technology, the social media, there are so many strikes against you. I saw this last week and thought it was funny. This is how we played online before the internet, all right? We just swirled around on the clothesline. It was a different world. Mom and Dad, you're going to have some backbone. You're going to have some spiritual tenacity, and you are going to have some courage to go against the grain. Amram and Jochebed had that. Now, what is it that makes courage courage? Well, it's normally the fact that if you're going to do right, you're in the minority. If you're going to do right, most people aren't going to do right. You're going to be outnumbered. And Amram and Jochebed were grossly outnumbered, and you are grossly outnumbered. Are you aware that most kids do not raise, or most parents do not raise their children by the Bible? You go, duh. Well, we forget that from time to time. It's just so assumed in our homes and in our church family. But outside these four walls, most homes do not raise their kids by the Bible. Most homes do not attend church. If you are attending church faithfully, you are in the minority. That's the exception, not the rule. Most homes do not talk about God. And I'm not talking about horrible homes out there, but just normal homes. They don't talk about God. Most homes don't follow godly standards. In fact, most homes, they'll tell their daughter, if you're messing around, just don't get pregnant. Use this and be careful. That's just kind of the way it is. Most homes. Most kids today use profanity. Most kids. But you teach your kids not to do that. Most kids today engage in dirty jokes and dirty movies, and there you are, you come along and you shield your kids from all that. Most homes and most kids listen to music that is saturated with sex outside of these four walls. And they do video games that are ungodly, but your family doesn't. So here's your kids, and they see that. They talk to their cousins. They talk to kids in the neighborhood. They see what's going on out there, and they say, why don't we do that stuff? It's going to take courage to raise your kids. You're going to have to resist that pop culture, especially if your kids are not wise enough to see the benefit of godliness. And most young people, are not interested in pleasing the Lord outside of these four walls. It's just not instilled in them. Most families aren't interested in pleasing the Lord. That's not on their radar at all. Not at all. So here you are, and you have unsaved relatives. And those unsaved relatives, they roll their eyes at what you're doing. Maybe your kids have unsaved grandpas and grandmas. And that's not unheard of. Grandpa and grandma aren't saved. And so they say, oh, let your kids do that. Let your kids go there. Let your kids do that. It takes courage to resist that culture. Are you willing to stand up to that kind of a pop culture? Now, here's Amram and Jochebed, and Egypt was no picnic. Don't think for a skinny second that it was a godly place. It was not an easy place to raise children. It's not an easy place today in America to raise children. The devil has done a number on our society. They don't get it. They don't see it. You are going to have to resist all the drivel and all the crud of this culture in order to raise children today. Do you have the strength to do what's right? Are you willing to pay that price, to resist the garbage of this world? Are you willing to do what's right? The commercials that are on television, the activities that people engage in, the mindset that people have, there's so much pressure out there for you to conform to their agenda. And if you don't believe they have an agenda, you are super naive. They have an agenda. Drag queens can lecture young children in public schools, and afterwards, after the lecture, little gullible kids go running out with a rainbow flag. Woo, this is great, and so on. But a Christian will try and get in there and teach them how to obey mom and dad, how to salute the flag and honor your country and all this and that's not allowed. That's not, oh, no, we can't allow you in there, but everything else is. We have lost our minds. We have absolutely lost our minds. We have lost our morals. We have lost our bearings. We have lost our compass. We have lost it. Our only hope is the biblical family and a New Testament church to assist that biblical family. Our hope is not in Washington. Our hope is not in the state. Our hope is not in politics. It's in godly families who can resist the culture. God help us to resist the culture, because wickedness is only going to get worse between now and the rapture. Now, open your eyes and see what's happening. Hang on and decide you are going to do what's right. You resist the pop culture. Amram and Jochebed did that. I mean, I'm looking at an ungodly law that Pharaoh passed to kill babies. Stop and think about that. Put the babies to death. Does that sound familiar? I mean, right up until the time of birth now, we have laws being passed in this country. Go ahead and kill the babies. We have lost it, folks. We've lost our minds. We really have. We had a U.S. senator from this state who, after a bill like that was reinforced and passed, high-fived an East Coast senator like, good, look what we did. We've lost our minds. We are barbarians. And Pharaoh, in the same way, said, if a baby boy is born, throw him to the gods of the Nile, sacrifice them to the crocodiles. And so the midwives were told, if it's a baby boy, you turn him in. Well, did they do it? Here in Exodus chapter 1, notice in verse 17, it says, but the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. They disobeyed. They disobeyed the civil authority. You say, well, Pastor, wait a minute here. Is it okay to obey those in authority? As long as authority is clearly going contrary to God, to His Word, there is a time to say no. And there are some things right now going on that are clearly contrary to God. And it's a time to take our stand, folks. It's a time to dig in. You know that the apostles, shortly after Christ ascended back up to heaven, were called in on the carpet and told not to preach in the name of Jesus anymore. And you know what they did? We read in Acts 5 that Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Now, I think they did it in a civil way, in a respectful way, but they said, I'm sorry, but when it comes to obedience, we'll obey you in every way we can, but ultimately, we have to obey the highest authority. It doesn't get any higher than God, and if you tell us to do something contrary to what God has told us to do, we ought to obey God rather than men. We fear God more than you, and let's echo that today. I fear God more than I do our society, than I do the politicians. I fear God more than ungodly leaders and unscriptural policy that's being passed here. I don't fear man more than I fear God, but that snares a lot of people. I read in Proverbs 29:25, the fear of man bringeth a snare, but whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be safe. Well, Amram and Jochebed did that. The parents of Moses said, you know what, we fear God more than we do Pharaoh. And look, if you're living in an ungodly culture, take that same demeanor. If you got an unsaved coworker that rolls their eyes at some of the stand that you're taking, if you have unsaved relatives that are going, oh, brother, whatever it might be, remember the midwives here, all right? They said, no, we're not going to cave in. So what happened to them? Well, I love this. In verse 20, therefore God punished them for disobeying civil authority. Is that what it says? No. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very great. Those gals had courage, and they had courage in the midst of a culture that was killing babies. Killing babies, if you can imagine that. Now, in chapter 2, in verse number 1, it says, and there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi, and the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. Again, how did they ever do that? For 3 months. You talk about miracles in the Bible. Okay, this is one of them here. If you've raised children, this just doesn't happen. They squawk. So how do you hide a baby for 3 months? Well, it was impossible without divine help, and I'm sure there were close calls. And it got to the place where, you know what, we just can't keep doing this. This baby's going to give us away. But they had tenacity. They resisted the pop culture. They were fighting for their kids. In verse number 3, it says, and when Jochebed could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's bank. You say, well, Pastor, it bothers me. Why doesn't it mention Amram here? Why wasn't he there doing it? because he was probably already up and working at this point. Remember, he was a slave. From dawn to dusk, he's working all day long. And so Jochebed does it. Now, she's kind of obeying Pharaoh's order. If you think about it, she's putting her baby in the Nile, right? Yeah, but with a little twist. She sealed up a little basket and put him in the basket. You know, I've often wondered if there's going to be a museum in heaven with a lot of artifacts there, you know, from Bible time. And I'm wondering, is this basket going to be there? I don't know, but I do know this. Amram and Jochebed didn't give up. They didn't give up. They hoped and they prayed and they stepped out by faith. And they, first of all, had a resistance to the pop culture. But secondly, they recognized potential. They recognized potential. I'll explain that. In verse 2, it says, "And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months." Now, wait a minute. What's goodly mean here? Well, goodly here means precious. It means pleasant. It means sweet. It means good-natured. You know, if you've had several kids like we have, some might be a little colicky as babies, some might be just good-natured and so on. Moses was one of those babies. He was just a sweetheart of a little baby. Now, notice we saw it a moment ago that they hid him for 3 months because they saw he was a proper child. And that word proper there, it means goodly, it means fair and beautiful. So Moses was a beautiful baby, but there's something more to this here. Look again in verse number 2. "The woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw that he was a goodly child." A goodly child means tob in the Hebrew, beautiful, pleasant, good-natured, goodly. So here's this cute little baby, and as they looked at him, here's what's really implied here in the Hebrew and the Greek. What's implied here is they looked at him and they saw something in him. They saw something God had laid on their heart, something special about this boy that God wanted to use. And I think somehow Moses grew up knowing this, maybe even knowing he was to be this deliverer, because there's some hints about this. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen's preaching, and he says, "For he, Moses, supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not." Here's when he went about doing it his own way. And you say, well, why did he try something like that? Because somehow he knew that he was to be some kind of a deliverer. Now, where did he get that? I can only imagine that maybe Amram and Jochebed initially believed that, and they raised Moses to believe that. Moses, God has a special calling for you. Mom and Dad, do you believe that God has a special calling for your children? Do you have a confidence that God wants to do something special with your son or your daughter? We had a fellow stand in this pulpit last year, Dr. Larry Clayton. He's crowding 90 now. He's been in the ministry something like 70 years. And I'll tell you what, he has forgotten more than I'll ever know about serving God. God has used him greatly over the decades. But he was the last of a bunch of babies born in Ohio, and quite a gap between him and the last child. He was a caboose, as some kids like that are called, and he was not expected. And when he was born, he was 13 pounds. I mean, imagine giving birth to a 13-pound bowling ball, basically. And so this baby boy came out, and that doctor looked at his mother and said, "Bertha, you got to quit having big kids like this. It's going to kill you." And she said, "I know I'm way too old to raise them right now, and I'm going to just give them to God." And it was a large family, but that last little baby boy was dedicated to God. And he grew up knowing he had been dedicated to God, and he went on to do something special for God. Now, Mom and Dad, do you really believe that God's hand is on your children? That God wants to do something special with your children? You should. You should. You should have that kind of faith. Do you believe that God really is going to do something with your son or your daughter? Now, I'm not sure why, but on more than one occasion, I don't know if I was a teenager, I don't know if I was a pre-teenager, but I do know that my mother thought I would wind up in the ministry, and I had no idea why. Sure wasn't acting like it, but she was right in a sense, and it wasn't the way she was thinking, obviously, but Mom couldn't reconcile one thing. I mean, of her 6 boys, she always said, I think Tony's going to be the priest. I heard her telling my aunt that. her sister. I think he's going to be a priest, except for the fact he loves babies and he loves kids. And of course, priests don't have babies and they don't have children. I do know this. I always wanted to do something special for God, but I had no intention of it being in the ministry. That was not my idea. But even my dear mother, before she got saved, I'm talking about back when she was lost, she had a hope that one of her 6 boys would be in the ministry and serve God as she knew it at that time. Now, let me just say to you saved moms and dads here, do you have a hope that God can use your child for his glory? Do you recognize that potential? I believe that Amram and Jochebed did, because I think that confidence was transferred to the boy Moses, to where by the time he grew up, it's like, okay, I'm to be some kind of deliverer here. I better get with it. Now, back here in Exodus chapter 2 and in verse number 1, it says, and there went a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. I want you to notice something else here about recognizing potential in your children, and that is they may go on to do something greater than you ever did for God. Because in verse 1, notice it just mentions a man of the house of Levi, a daughter of Levi. And I find it interesting that Amram and Jochebed aren't even mentioned here. In fact, they're not mentioned for a few chapters here when Moses comes back to be the deliverer of Israel. Now, my point is this, Mom and Dad, you may never have a big name in this world. You may never be famous. You may never be renowned. You may never get the kudos. You may never get the accolades. But you can raise a young person spiritually who does. I couldn't tell you the names of the mother and father of George Washington. I have no idea. I couldn't name the parents of Lincoln. I couldn't name the parents of Eisenhower. I couldn't name the parents of MacArthur. I'll guarantee you this, they all had a mom and a dad. But the point is this, the child went on to become way more famous than the parents and helped save this nation. Well, Amram and Jochebed raised a son that saved a nation. I mean, literally saved Israel. You never know what your child may amount to. You may be raising a great missionary. You may be raising a great missionary's wife. You don't know. You may be raising a real witness for Christ. You may be raising a great giver to the work of Christ. You may be raising a great prayer, a great servant of Christ, maybe a pastor, maybe a pastor's wife. I'll guarantee you this, my folks never guessed that I'd be a Baptist preacher. Never. If you'd have given them a list of 100 things that I would become one day, and that would have been on the list, they wouldn't have even considered it. But I'll guarantee you, they are glad today that I am. Moses' mom and dad never achieved the notoriety or the fame of Moses. He's mentioned 784 times in the Bible. And here's Amram, 13 times. By the way, Jochebed's mentioned twice by name. But both of them were well rewarded in heaven because they gave a contribution to the world that changed the world. And by the way, Moses almost didn't amount to anything. It all took place after he was age 80. If you have a child here and they're getting up there and you go, well, they still haven't come around. They're still not serving the Lord. They're still not doing great exploits. Give it time. Give it time. Moses didn't mature until he was 80 years of age. He would not even been in the Bible if it wouldn't have been for what he did those last decades of his life. So give it time. I said if you're going to give the next generation God, you have to resist pop culture. Secondly, you have to recognize potential. And finally, you have to remain proactive. You have to remain proactive. You know, I have a faith that my children are going to turn out. I have a faith that my grandchildren are going to turn out, but I'm proactive about it. I spend time, and we do things on purpose because faith is not passive. Somebody says, well, I have a feeling my kids will turn out. Well, faith is not passive. Faith doesn't sit around. Faith is not lethargic. Faith is not stagnant. Faith is not apathetic. That's not faith at all. Faith is not laid back. You know, for 37 years, we've tried to practice faith here at Fargo Baptist Church. We have never been passive. And so have faith, yes. The same goes with your family. So here's Amram and Jochebed, and they didn't just let it come to them. Well, we'll just let it come to us, and you can't either. Somebody says, well, I just believe that God will take care of my kids, and so I'm just going to kick back and watch him do it. Wrong. You know, when I went to Bible college back in the 80s, pastors in the 70s and 80s in Bible college were telling those pastors in training that if you just take care of the church of God, God will take care of your kids. You know what happened? They were wrong. Guess what? Scores of pastors lost all of their kids with that philosophy because it's not right. And so you have got to be proactive. Now, don't have a knee-jerk reaction the other way to where like, well, okay, we're just going to be turbo parents and spend all these gobs of times with our kids and stop serving God. No, serve God with your kids. There's a novel thought. Just serve God with your kids. And I appreciate the parents in this church who do that. But my point is faith is not passive. It's proactive. And you are going to have to be on the offense. You're going to have to be aggressive in this. I saw this picture also this last week, and boy, picture is worth 1,000 words, isn't it? You've got all that drivel coming at your kids, and there you need to have that shield, and you need to have that Bible, and you need to counter all of that. You know, Amram and Jochebed were not about to turn in baby Moses to be thrown to the crocodiles, to be thrown to the world. They were proactive, and God honored that. So Amram and Jochebed came up with a strategy. It could cost them their lives, but they trusted God anyway. In verse 3, it says, and when she could not longer hide him, baby Moses, she, Jochebed, took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. Now, here's what happened. In my mind, I picture her calling little Aaron to her side and saying, son, I want you to go and get some bulrushes for mommy. Okay, yes, mommy. And Miriam, I want you to go find some slime and find some pitch and bring it back. And we're going to weatherproof a little basket for your little brother, Moses. Okay, mommy. And so they work together as a family. And by the way, I love to see that. I grew up in a family of 11. And if you got 11 people, it's a beehive. It's a nest of activity. And you have got to have teamwork. There's people everywhere. There's stuff going on. You know, my wife and I raised our 5 to work together as a family. And together we did a lot. We worked together. We played together. We traveled a lot. And we were always in church, by the way. And I find it interesting now. My kids are doing all the same stuff that we used to do. We're over in Bemidji, or we're over in Park Rapids, we're over in Detroit Lakes, and it's like all the same places we used to go to, and they're doing things. And we did a lot of stuff together. And by the way, we were still always in church. As we traveled, we were normally home for the weekend. We were normally in the house of God. You know, don't be one of those who thinks, I got to go all over the place to amuse my kids. No, the Bible says of the virtuous woman, her feet abide in her home. That's part of what makes her virtuous, okay? So we were home, we were in church, and we were trying to teach our kids right stuff. And we taught them a lot, but you know what really floored me after the fact is how much they caught. They caught it. I don't remember ever teaching it to them, but they think like we think. They work like we work. We taught our kids practical life skills. And by the way, kids today don't have those kind of skills. The only skills they have is this. There they are all the time, just little flicker thumbs there, just getting all that stuff done. And honestly, it warps their personality. They're duds. They have no personality. They're a bump on a log. Yeah, you talk to the average young person, and they spend all those hours on those video games, and they don't have a personality. And let me just say this. We live in an entitlement society, and kids grow up with that thinking, well, I deserve a cell phone. I deserve all this stuff. No, they don't. Let them earn those privileges. And when they show they're responsible, and they show that they have the character for them, you'll know. And it's time. And now they get it. It builds an ark around them so they don't drown in the Nile. I see kids today being thrown into the Nile. They're not ready, and they're sucking for air. Amram and Jochebed had a little window. They had a little window of time. And the result was Moses. He was one of a kind. He changed the world. How do we change the world with the next generation? Well, let me just say this first of all. There's no substitute for mom and dad. There is no substitute for mom and dad. Now, we are a local New Testament church. We are a scriptural New Testament church. And that is part of God's plan. God started the institution of the home. God started the institution of the local church. And God's plan is to have a church that helps you in your parenting. Because a church is the pillar and ground of the truth. And so the way the hand goes into the glove, the church and the family go together. And let me just say here at Fargo Baptist Church, we love the family. We love the home. We love songs like this a moment ago. We love this domestic stuff. There's something about kids. By the way, you parents, your kids, your boys play football right outside my office over here. It is so fun to just look out my window and watch them. And they're going out for passes and they're running. So, man, I'd like to just go out there and show them how it's done. The moves, the speed, the hands. And the longer ago it was, the better I was. You know what I mean? But let me just say this. We've got a great teen group. We really do. I mean that. I've been here for 37 years. We have some really, really good attitudes right now. And I really want to commend our parents. Oh, I know your kids dig in from time to time. But overall, and I might not be speaking for every young person, but for the most part, we have a great spirit here. We really do. But the church exists to be that hand in the glove, but it is no substitute for your parenting your kids the rest of the week. And so we have a good group. We have a good spirit. We have cooperation. We have interest and so on. We really need to capitalize on that. We really need to go with that. And we have some people here that help in that. We have some folks, I'm looking at them right now. We have others throughout the building. We have a nursery director in here. I don't know if there's a church in the country with a lady who takes that job more seriously, and rightly so. It's an important job. We have other ladies at the hour before this one, and now some men and women who are teaching young people at this hour. I teach in the class in the library before this hour. It's got a big glass window, and I'm looking toward the hallway, and I'm trying to teach when I see all this stuff going on. But there are people just doing their job, and they're working with your kids. God bless them for that. We have a couple that is teaching your kids right now, and they've been doing it for over 20 years, faithfully at this hour, making an investment in your children. And if you work with kids in this church, thank God for you. If you oversee children in some way, if you work with our teens, I know that a part of the Pastor Mackey does. I know that Brother Daniel does. I know that there are moms who work with the teen choir. I know we've got bus workers. By the way, if you see somebody get up and leave before the end of the message, it wasn't because I offended him. He's going to drive a bus, okay? And that happens every week. You know, these kids we're bringing into these four walls could be future missionaries, future husbands and wives who are serving. And we are, as a church, here to help. And that's all I want to say. And by the way, if you're a single parent, let a New Testament church come alongside of you and try and help. I know that's very difficult, but God help you. When your child is in church, he or she is getting the truth they really need to navigate through all the landmines that the devil has planted out there, to blow them up and to take them down. And all week long, the world is hurling lies at your kids, hurling error at your kids, and the devil has a bullseye on your kids. You know, I've faced some adversity over the years, my decades of pastoring, from within and from without, and I'm telling you, the devil's relentless, but the greatest attack he will make is on my kids, my grandkids, your kids, because he knows the next generation is that important. So remember the slide. Don't forget that. Shield your kids from all that stuff. You're going to have some fierce personal attacks. But I'm so glad that we have a New Testament church to help us. Kids need truth and to combat the folly and the drivel of this world. You know, if you're following the news right now, you know that the Olympics is just around the corner. And we have some folks from this church who are going to go there and an outreach effort try and bring the gospel to folks, and I'm thankful for that. I know part of the activities at the Olympics is something called a relay race. If you've run track, you know what this is all about. And a relay race is just that. Somebody keeps handing the baton to the next one, who hands it to the next one, hands it to the next one. That's what we're doing, folks. We're trying to hand that baton off to the next generation spiritually. We read here in Exodus of some parents, Amram and Jochebed, who succeeded in doing it, and it changed the course of the world. You never know who you're raising, but whoever it might be, let's give God to the next generation.